Welcome to Gaming Gaiden, everybody. This is the podcast that uncovers the side stories of the gaming world as well as the world of Japanese to English localization. I'm Andrew, and this is Mike.
That would be me.
And we have this week with us Katrina Leonoudakis.
Very close, Leonoudakis. It's nice to meet you.
Leonoudakis. Thank you.
That's funny. I practiced the pronunciation from the Translation Chat podcast, and I think it was Leonoudakis there.
Yeah, sometimes it's easier just not to correct people. Like when I'm at the airport, they inevitably just say like Katrina L.
Yeah.
Okay, I just got married last year, and I'm waiting on my name change to go through, so I'll be very easy to pronounce Katrina Mitchell. But in my publishing and games, I'm still gonna keep the long, lengthy last name just to make people like you pronounce it.
Okay, cool.
Leonoudakis.
Leonoudakis.
Okay, got it. All right, so that's the pronunciation, everybody. All right, so Katrina has localized games such as Catherine Full Body, Yakuza 3-5 Remastered, Persona 5, 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim. It's right, Aegis, not Aegis.
Either or.
Okay. Persona 5 Strikers, Lost Judgment, Sonic Colors, Ultimate Demon Slayer, The Hinokami Chronicles, Shin Megami Tensei 5, Lost Judgment, The Kaido Files, Persona 3, Portable, Persona 4, Portable,
Golden,
and many more. And a lot of anime and manga, but we're going to probably get to that a little bit, but it's going to be mainly about the gaming side of things once we get to all that kind of stuff. So... Katrina, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Much appreciated. Thank you. You know, we have no history, right? We're a new show getting started, and we see that you have a very extensive body of work there. So we really do appreciate you coming on out for this.
Like I said, I'm always glad to come on and make people listen to me talk about translation theory. So win-win for me.
Hey.
Let us start from the beginning. When did you, what got you into Japan in the first place?
Oh, Lord. I mean, I'm your typical millennial weeb. So, you know, I grew up, I was super into Toonami. I watched all the DBZ, Sailor Moon. I wanted to be a Sailor Scout when I was a kid. It wasn't until I realized like manga was a thing. Like I was in a Barnes and Noble, and I'm like, whoa, Cyborg 009 has comic books. Let's go. And then like my piano teacher's grandson lent me all of his Inuyasha manga, and that's when they were flipping it. So you still had to read it from left to right. And I got super into that. I met some friends in middle school who were super into anime, and then I got really into anime. My dad was like, oh, I'll buy you like an intro to Japanese book in high school. Devoured that, was like, whoa, Japanese is so cool. And then just ended up really diving into that. I did the whole cosplay thing. I learned Japanese. I was fan translating for a while all through high school. And then I added it as a second major in college. I did that thing where I was like, oh, it's just my hobby. I don't want to do it as a career. It's just going to be for fun. But then I was like, well, I might as well take the major anyway, since I'm going to take all these Japanese related classes. And I might as well study abroad since I'm so ahead in all my studies. Like I can afford to take a semester. And then as soon as I like got to Japan and started looking at like grad schools, because I was majoring in psychology, was my primary major. I was looking at grad programs. And I'm just like, none of these sound really interesting. And then one of my old professors was like, well, look at translation school. Like, you've done really well in Japanese. Like, look at translation schools. And the second I started looking at programs, I'm like, oh, that looks kind of interesting. Oh, that looks cool. And then I knew, I was like, shit, like, I have to go. I have to go to translation school. Let's go. So I finally did. I applied. I ended up applying to the JET program as well. I got into both. So I deferred grad school for a year to do a year at JET. Ended up out in the middle of nowhere in this tiny little village out in Yamanashi-ken. Fantastic year. Then I came back and did 2 years at Kent State to get my master's in Japanese translation and project management. And then, freelance for a couple of years. Ended up getting hired by Atlas, which got absorbed into Sega. Was there for just about 5 years. And I just left literally like 3 weeks ago to start at Deluxe to do more subtitling and dubbing for video. So
at Deluxe?
Yes.
I've worked there as well in the past, actually.
Hey, yeah, I just ended up there. So yeah, I'll be doing a lot of supervision for dubbing, subtitling, pretty much anything that has to do with localization, not just at Deluxe, but like as a whole. Localization, anything like comics, video, games. If we're going from Japanese to English, there's such different languages and cultures. It's just really interesting what kind of theories and stuff that you can apply to make stuff work better in our language and culture. And that's not necessarily by changing anything, but just by
Mhm.
the language we use. So, anyways,
Yeah.
I'm a big nerd. I love translation theory. I love translating. I probably could have picked a field that pays better, like technology patents or like automotive
Mhm.
translation. But
Right.
I'm once a weeb, always a
It's
weeb, and now I am the weebist. So here we
yeah.
are.
Mainly anime and and manga, but not so much games at first.
Not so much games at first. I was exploring freelancing. Anybody who's a freelancer knows it's very feast or famine. You'll
Mhm.
go like 6 months with no work, and then all of a sudden you're booked full for like another 6 months, and you're so busy like you can't take time off. And that was great at first, especially when I was getting a lot of work. But those famines hit really hard, and I live in Los Angeles, so rent's really
Mhm.
high. And I was looking for something to get a little bit more stability, and it just so worked out that Atlas was looking for translators. So that's how I ended up getting into gaming. And then within probably the first year of working at Atlas and then Sega, I ended up transitioning into a more of a localization engineering and like project management role,
Mhm.
starting with Persona 5 Royal. And then I was pretty much on almost every localization project, doing all the backend engineering and like file and project coordination until I left.
Did you find out that
Mm.
you probably found out you were good at Japanese kind of early on, I assume. Uh,
That's a really interesting thing to say because I look back on some of those first translations I did because it was all fan translations. I had like a
Mhm.
WordPress and it was all posted on there, and like people on Tumblr were retweeting or reblogging all my translations and stuff. But I look back at those now and I was like, oh man, I had no idea what I was doing. Totally made this line up. Had no idea what this phrase meant, so I translated it super literally. But I think what really helped for me was that I wasn't too focused on like making sure it was super, like I wanted it to be accurate and I wanted it to be good. Um,
Mhm.
but what was more important for me was that instant gratification of like posting, hey, I translated this fan translation thing, and like instantly 200 people being like, oh my God, I really wanted to read this like Twitter comic or something like that in English. So it was really that kind of gratification. And then from there, just like having more fun with the translation and, figuring out how complicated stuff could get. Cause they have that whole thing in psychology where it's like I forget what the name of the curve is, but it's like the less you know, the better you think you are. And then the more you know, you're like,
Yeah.
oh man, there's so
Dunning
much
oh
more.
yeah.
Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, it was total
Was it
Dunning-Kruger effect.
is it
But
Dunning-Kruger? Is that right? I'm
I
thinking.
that
But
sounds
yeah.
right.
It
I have a
sounds right.
psychology degree. I can't remember. I haven't used it in like 10 years. But yeah, no, games. I love games. I love video games. And it was really great being at Sega for those 5 years, getting so involved with not just game, like how do we localize the text in the games, but like stuff to
Mhm.
like the background images or the graphics or like what do we need to do to make this marketing campaign work in English. So
Mhm.
lots of really cool moving parts there. And with games, like unlike maybe with an anime or a manga, like it's already finished by the time you get to translate it. Like with games, it's like, cool, here's the alpha. It's not ready. Nothing in this is final, and we might rewrite this character's entire route.
Yeah.
But here's what we have now.
Mhm.
So many more moving parts. It's very chaotic, but it was also very. I learned so much from it. I really enjoyed it.
What was the hardest part learning when you were learning Japanese? Was it like reading, writing, or speaking, or one section? Some people don't like kanji, stuff like that.
I feel like for me, definitely at first it was kanji.
Mhm.
And I developed such like a hate relationship with it. Just like I have to learn more kanji. There's always more kanji I have to learn. But then I TA'd a year of Japanese one, which does very little kanji. So like those first 12 weeks is just practicing to write in hiragana. And
Mhm.
trying to read like 8 lines of hiragana is so hard.
Mm, I know.
It's funny you mentioned that. We just today I learned a new hiragana character that I had never studied before. I turned on my Switch and they had a video of what's his name? Uh the guy from Game Center CX, Kacho-san or whatever. And there was something there and I'm looking at it and I'm like, that looks like me, but it's not me. So I had to go looking on some different diagrams and I found we or WI. Yeah. And I was like, what the? I've never seen this in all my years. I've never encountered this. So yeah, just today I learned a new character in hiragana.
Yeah, or
Of
it's
all
like
things.
in Evangelion, the N Evangelion is a we, technically.
Okay.
The
I
the
saw
the
that come up
the
with that
in
same
it.
tape.
No,
It's like,
no, the
what?
from
Oh,
Evangelion.
yeah, yeah,
Technically,
yeah.
it's a we.
Oh my God.
So those were the two that I didn't recognize down there, right? We and we, and I was just like, where did these come from, and why did I never encounter them?
Well, if you want the full story, no, linguistically they used to use we and we, but then people just while they were speaking, kind of how we used to say like goodbye was like God be with you, and then we just kind of
Mhm.
contracted into goodbye. That kind of happened with we and we. Like whoa used to be more of a whoa, but then people
Mhm.
just started dropping the W sound, so it's more of an O now.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
I mean that's
Language is always like taking the path of least resistance.
I love it. No, it's just it's really interesting. I'm gonna be the biggest language nerd about that kind of shit, but like
Yeah, like
so much fun.
Yebisu.
Like Yebisu, yeah,
Yeah.
basically. But to like actually answer your question, I think for me the hardest thing for me right now is a lot of business Japanese.
Mm.
Mm.
I learned a lot while I was at Sega, but there's always just seemed to be more. Like every time I was writing an email, I would have some of my senpais check over it. And they'd just be like, "Oh, this is great, but this is like a completely different expression you should use for asking this." And I was like, "Why are they making up new grammar for specifically for business emails? Just ask the stupid question." They're like, "No, no, no, that's not how it works." So,
Mm.
I think my favorite thing too is like when you go and Google in Japanese, like I would straight up ask like gomen nasai, like business email writing, and then you get thousands of articles because like
Right.
a lot of Japanese people also don't know these special rules of writing crazy
Mhm.
business emails, which is very frustrating. But then you think back on like, oh, when you're in elementary school, they taught you how to write a letter. You have to say dear blah 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 and say like a
Mhm.
greeting and say sincerely at the end. So, there's all these hidden rules of language that we grow up with learning until, you try to learn a new language and now you have all these new stupid rules. Well, they're not stupid. They're just very unique rules to learn. And I always forget how to use Keiko. So
Yeah. I mean, I'm a language teacher as well. I teach English as a second language, and there's definitely that sense all the time of, wait, but why would you do that? And then it's like, well, let's look back at your first language and find that the same thing exists there, but you've never questioned it because it's natural.
yeah, no, my husband took a couple Japanese classes, and every time he would come back and he's like, "Babe, why is this grammar this? Why is it this way? Why is this kanji read 5 different ways?" And I'm like, "Yeah, well, we have the same thing in English. Like, have you tried spelling words?" And he's like, "It's
Mhm.
different. It's different in English." I'm like, "No, it's not. Every language has some weird irregularity." Since we're talking about languages, I know we have to go on, but Esperanto actually which is a man-made language, which is supposed to be
Mhm.
not irregular at all, has started to develop its own irregular verbs
Whoa.
through people using it. Because people, like, as people were speaking, like, I forget what verb or something it was, but they found that it was easier to say the verb with a different type of conjugation than the one they were
Mhm.
supposed to use. And they just got so used to mixing it up that it became part of their natural language. But of course,
Yep.
everyone's up in a big uproar because Esperanto is not supposed to have irregulars. But now all the people who speak Esperanto are using this
Yep.
irregular verb. So what do you do? So it's really
If
interesting, how not just like even when we try to create something perfect that's not irregular, that just has to be look, we're humans.
what
We have to make it
Yeah,
weird.
that's it. That's how it's gonna
I
work.
love it.
I had some language shock when I first started studying Japanese uh, in college. When they when you first learn that the verb's always at the end, I really felt my brain working against itself at first because I was just so solidly locked into SVO, subject verb object, and just even to make that change was kind of like, well, for the time at least, it was almost monumental for me. But I feel like some people have absolutely no problem. And when I taught English to Japanese kids in Japan, Mike was there. We worked at the same company for a bit. Like it seemed like the Japanese kids, like the verb being in the middle with English, seemingly anyway. I didn't have any deep conversations with them about it, but seemed like it didn't ever shock them. They're like, "Oh yeah, it's English. It's just different." You know what I mean? But for me, it was like my only other exposure to languages was French and Spanish and German, European languages. So I thought every language on the planet was SVO. But I guess if you're learning English first, and it seems like Japanese people generally just think that there's a stigma around English as well. But, like They just think that they're just going to assume it's the hardest thing possible anyway, just from the get go. So I find all the perspective surrounding the language in each culture to be interesting.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely really, really interesting. I think the hardest thing that my kids had difficulty with when I was in Japan was the
Mhm.
difference between and the.
Oh yeah,
Oh yeah,
Couldn't wrap their heads around it.
oh yeah.
And that really made me think back on English, being like, "Oh, how do I explain this?" Like, got to go back through my grammar books and try to find the rules that determine which one you use. And I had a lot of middle schoolers yelling at me, just be like, "This is stupid. Why do I have to use it? Why do I have to?" I'm just like, "It's just the way it is." Like, why do you have to
yeah,
use kanji? So a little bit, you have to go back and forth a little bit.
yeah. When I was teaching students who were native Spanish speakers, I was like, okay, well, let's sit down and lay out all the different articles that are in Spanish, and see how much more difficult it is than English. They usually didn't have a problem with it, but it's a matter of like, let's keep track of all this. Oh, I made this mistake. Is that a big mistake? And I'm like, well, is it a big mistake if I mix these two up in Spanish? And they're like, oh, you wouldn't do that. I'm like, you'd be surprised.
But I think that wa and ga are a little bit more regular than a and the are. That's just my opinion. You don't think so?
Uh, I think the articles are definitely much more easily defined. But of course, I have a different perspective. Of course, I'm a native English speaker and I'm a teacher of the language. Whereas at this point, what do I know about wa and ga? It's like I don't know. I just use them when I think they're right, and if I'm wrong, somebody will tell me. I hope,
I
but they
think
won't.
there are definitely like places where you're like, yeah, that's definitely a Y. You should definitely use a ga here. But there are kind of like in English, there are those really esoteric times when you're like, oh, I don't know which one I should use
Mm,
here.
mm-hmm.
Especially if you got a really long, complex sentence with multiple subjects. So, um, yeah, no, it's definitely it's there's a classic Dogen clip where it's like, is it wa or ga? And it's like you'll never know.
Yeah,
And
That
I
guy
feel
is
yeah.
that in my
incredible.
bones sometimes.
They're always fun. I like his videos. My language shock for Japanese has always been the sort of passive and causative forms, where it's a matter of thinking. I'm always going to be thinking in active tense. That's just it. I'm sorry, active voice. That's just how my English speaking brain functions. I know who did it and I know why they did it. I'm going to say it.
Yeah.
You're saying that instead of passive like ukemi?
The saseru,
Oh, causative.
causative and passive voices. I just like I can read something and kind of understand it, but I can't produce that. I'm never going to produce that, I think, naturally or quickly.
What about all the
Mhm.
like nomasete kureta and all that stuff?
Yeah, that's all receptive.
Yeah. Well, and then
I don't
then
know.
there's different forms of the causative, like the passive. Like the passive is used a lot to be formal. So
Mhm.
even though you're not saying like, oh, like he was saying, or like it was sad over there, like it's just being polite. And then there's a lot of I forget what it's actually called. It's some form of the causative where you're saying like I was sitting over there. There's no way to say, you say like I was sat there by
Mm.
some unknown force or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, no, it's just
Yeah.
very interesting, the idiosyncrasies of language. But I could go on about this forever. You wanted to talk about gaming though.
Oh
Sorry.
yeah. Well, we're kind of it's kind of all the above. But yeah, we can keep going. So Mike,
All good.
you got the next one, man, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, when you first started studying Japanese, you said you got this book, it was all for interest. Was that your goal? Was to simply sort of enjoy and understand these arts, or did you have anything bigger in mind when you got started studying?
I think for me, I didn't really have too much of a goal. So the book that my dad got me was Manga Gene's Basic Japanese through Comics.
Mhm.
Um, and the cool thing about that is it's not a textbook, but it is kind of an introductory book for like all the cool linguistic bits of Japanese. So like, yeah, they'll show you what the hiragana are, but there was like one page. It's like, here's the hiragana,
Mhm.
whatever. But then it would show you like, hey, Japanese has different first person pronouns depending on how you want to represent yourself. And this is how they're used in comics. And
Mm.
it would show like a comic and how like ore was used instead of watashi. They had a whole section on how people with different genders might express themselves with different emphatics, like wa or yo or ze or
Mhm.
zo. They had a whole section on kanji, but with ateji or with like different furigana than like so like putting like the kanji for power for chikara and instead putting
Mm.
power next to it. So instead of teaching like basic grammar or like all the basics or all the basic vocab, it went
Mhm.
straight into like here's what's cool about Japanese. And that's what
Right.
really got me was not the oh this is how you learn to say all your days of the week or how you say you went to the
Mhm.
store, but really like hey, like here's like the really cool shit. Like
Yeah.
people, depending on how you're feeling on a certain day, you might use a different version of the word I. And that
Mhm.
really got me into it. And of course, I was already a huge weep. So I
Mm.
had a Japanese copy of the first volume of Oran High School Host Club, and then I had the English
Mhm.
copy, and I would read both of them side by side, and
Nice.
just like be super like enthralled, be like, oh, Tamaki uses this first person pronoun and whatnot. So I think starting with that view of like, look at all the
Yeah.
cool stuff is in this language, like how different it is from our own, versus like, here's what a noun looks like, here's what a verb looks like, was a really great way to get me into the language. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I ended up stepping in.
No, that's cool. That's definitely an interesting perspective, a nice way to come at the language, sort of
Mhm.
exploring those little idiosyncrasies that you're going to, encounter all the time in comics and anime and everything.
Yeah, and it kind of poses it in a way that's like, look how cool this is, versus like maybe you're learning like Spanish or Arabic for the first time, and all of a
Mm.
sudden you run into these stupid things, and your teacher says, "Oh, don't worry about those yet; those aren't important." Well, those could be like the thing that brings you really into the language. Is
Right.
like, I want to
That's
learn more about this. Like, why is this weird word here, or like, why is this irregular? So
yeah.
I remember when
That's
I was I took
definitely.
classical Japanese in undergrad, and we started learning like the old ways of like back in like the 1400s 1500s how they were conjugating all their verbs, kind of like old English. um
Mhm.
and that's when like there's only a ton of us in the class, but they were talking about how um when you have a sound and a u sound in classical Japanese, it goes into an o sound. So if you write the hiragana a and then a hiragana u, it would go into o. And then our teacher said that's why you say ohayo gozaimasu, because it used to be ohayaku. They dropped the k sound and it would be ohayau and would go ohayo. Like all 10 of us,
Huh.
minds freaking blown. Like we learned that's like the first thing you learn in Japanese. And now
Yeah.
it's like, oh my God, there was a reason why we say Ohio. Like, boom. So
Yeah.
I love that kind of stuff about language. It's like, where does everything come from? Why do we say it this way? Like, why is this weird? Like, let's go. And then it gets even more complicated when you put it into like a video or a video game. So
Yeah.
Arigato is like literally hard to exist, right?
arigato is arigataku, which
Arigato.
is from arigatai, which is to be grateful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Oh yeah, arigato. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it would go instead it would be like arigataku gozaimasu, like I am very grateful. They dropped the K sound, went to arigatau, which got shortened to arigato.
Oh man, you know a lot
Yeah.
about kanbun and that type of Japanese.
Oh God, I can't. I think we did like 1 week or two on that with Kanbun. We did a lot more like Kobun, like we read like the Pillow Diaries, we did a lot of haiku, we
Mm.
did the Hyakuni Manshu, the Manyoshu, like all those poems and stuff like that, which helped out a lot when it ended up on Chihaya for like 10 years later. Um
That's
but
cool.
yeah, it's really fun. Also, I did just look it up. I was wrong. Arigatai does come from arigatashi, which is it's difficult.
It's
Mm.
difficult. See, I think some Japanese guy
Like
that I talked to
difficult to
once
exist. Yeah.
said that your kind act does not exist so easily.
Let me see
Mm.
here.
Something like that. I that could be a wrong interpretation, but uh,
Arigato ga motsu chikara. Okay, that seems a little bit. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, it does say metta ni naku kito de aru. Okay. Yeah, no, that is right. You are right. That is. See, now I'm learning something new. You learn something new every day. Let's go.
that
So
was
yeah, it is.
that was
Well,
from one of my students told me
right.
that. An older student, an adult student.
I think that leads pretty nicely into something I saw you writing about this equivalent experience, right?
Oh,
Writing
let's
about meanwhile.
go! It's translation
So
theory time. Let's go.
We've
I
entered it,
was
everybody.
I was hoping you could give us all give the audience a nice overview, and then maybe we talk a little bit about the pieces.
Oh, absolutely. So, translation theory, just like, theory of gravity doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong or right.
Mhm.
It is series of like ideas and theories and conjectures about how we use language or change language in translation to express the same idea in both ways. And it's not something that's new. Translation theory has been a field of education for thousands of years. People back in the Greeks were debating it, the Romans were debating it. There are riots in the streets over different translations of the Bible back in the medieval days. Like people have been debating translation theory forever, like all around the world. So it's not new when I start talking about translation theory and applying it to video games or anime or whatever you have it. Because this is stuff that's been built upon and built upon for thousands of years. So the one thing that, or one of the main concepts in translation theory that I really, really love is equivalent experience. And basically what that means is if you say you have like a video game or something, let's say like a Persona game. So when someone in the target audience, so that would be like us in the West playing in English, is playing this game, they should have an experience equivalent or as close to equivalent as possible as person in the original audience. So that would be someone in Japan playing it in the original language. So it seems very similar at first, like, oh, obviously, like they should have the equivalent experience, but there's so many different things that factor into that, both at kind of like the macro level and the micro level. For example, one thing we see a lot when we're looking at like video cutscenes is because Japanese is a subject object verb language versus English is a subject verb object language. Because the order of the grammar is different in a cutscene when they make like a dramatic like villain reveal, the word that they reveal is going to be like a completely different beat than it would be in the English sentence. So we have to rearrange the English sentence or completely rewrite it so that dramatic beat of like, it was me, Dio, hits at the exact same dramatic point, because we can't edit the like way that it hits in the cutscene because the cutscene is already pre-rendered. So stuff like that, like on the very small level, obviously is equivalent experience. But then you get stuff where it gets a little bit more contentious. For example, like maybe the Japanese game, like maybe it's like a Japanese indie game based around something that could be offensive to another culture. Like, oh, we're gonna depict all these religious figures. And here now we have like Muhammad. But in certain regions of the world, you can't depict Muhammad. That's not okay. So you can't, if you want to sell your game there, you're gonna have to call up the developers and be like, all right, like maybe we need to rework this. Obviously you probably couldn't publish a game about religious figures all over the world anyways.
Devil
But that's
World.
just kind of one of the things. Or like if you're writing like maybe a marketing thing about like the whole thing about like JRPGs is like get with your friends and kill God. Like that's the whole joke. But there are certain cultures around the world where if you even joke about killing God, they're not cool with that. So you need to change that marketing approach, even though it's a meme kind of like in our world and we have no problem saying that, jokingly saying those kind of things. Like you really have to look at how that would impact it, because in terms of equivalent experience, even though the words and the meaning of the words, like down to like the prescriptivist meaning, like that's, you're killing God, you are murdering a holy figure of God or whatever, the connotation it has within the culture, within the audience, is completely different. And because that experience is different, it's not an equivalent translation. So a lot of people, you'll see a lot of people saying, oh, I want more literal translation. I don't want you to change anything in the translation. Well, the issue is if you don't quote unquote change stuff, if you don't localize, if you don't consider all of the different things going on in the target that might affect how somebody experiences what you're giving them, you're not going to be giving them the same experience. So yeah, it's a very, very complicated, crazy tangle of things. There's all these tiny little pieces that factor into equivalent experience. But yeah, no, that's absolutely my favorite thing. And then, of course, if you want to make things more complicated, you don't always want to give people, you don't always want to give people an equivalent experience. Obviously, when we're localizing video games, you know, it's the same purpose as they were doing back in Japan. Like people play video games to have fun. They want to experience the story, connect with the characters and whatnot. But what if we're taking this video game and translating it for like people doing their PhD in language and game design, or we're taking this game and saying, okay, well, we can't market this to adults, so let's market it to children. Now it's a completely different thing. We have to take out the blood. We have to take out, you know, he's smoking a cigarette. You can't show that to kids in the US. And now you have to make it a lollipop. So you have to call the devs and say, hey, we need a lollipop sprite. So that not equivalent exchange. This isn't Full Metal Alchemist. Equivalent experience is not always something you want to go for, but it is quite often the case when we're localizing video games, when we're doing anime or manga, or any kind of TV or video. We want to make sure that whoever is consuming the translated product has the same experience. So very simple in concept, but very complicated to execute because we're very complicated.
So it's not always best to translate arigato as it is difficult.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. But there's so many, and the thing with language is that it's so context dependent. You know, a sarcastic thank you in English, you may not want to translate that as arigato in Japanese because they don't use a lot of sarcasm in Japan. It's not a big thing over there as it is kind of in our humor.
Yeah.
So that might be something you might want to change. It's so complicated and it's so much fun. But
yeah, I had never really thought about the idea of it not being an equivalent of experience because of cultural sensitivities. And yeah, obviously that's definitely been done before. So that's good. Thank you for pointing that out.
yeah, no, and it's funny because a lot of like detractors of localization will say like, oh, like they're censoring stuff or they're moving stuff like what I mentioned, like religious figures or like making fun of killing God is like the 0.001% of all the issues we handle in localization. Most of the time it's like, oh great, he just said yoroshiku. Like how do we get a really, really quick like hey
Generic
there
platitudes
that
are
also
very
conveys
hard.
all of that meaning because it's especially like when you're dubbing, I keep going back to cutscenes, but like when you're dubbing cutscenes, you have to match the lip flaps. So if they say like bakana, they're using that b sound, so you have to be unbelievable or something like that that'll still fit in that really short period, but work with the lip flaps. So that's like 99.9% of what localization is working with that.
I think that somebody found a trick around this. I don't know if you guys have seen, it's called As Dusk Falls, I believe. It's a newer game. It's a story-based game. It's got like branching dialogue options, and you go back and you can see the timeline of how your choices played out and what other options you had. It released recently. I think it's an Xbox and Windows exclusive, maybe. It released with 23 languages supported.
Wow.
Whoa.
Voice or text?
Now, I haven't explored all of it, but what I noticed was, and it's interesting how the brain, this whole like Gestalt theory, right? It sort of fills in all the gaps. There's what you might say limited animation or a bare minimum of animation, kind of like a motion comic. So when I try to remember the game, it feels in my mind and my memory like the character is speaking and moving, but they're not. It's a still image of the character. But the voice acting is so strong and so convincing that when I think back to it, I remember it as if it were fully animated, which I think may be very nice and easy to work with when you don't have to match up lip
when you don't have to
flaps.
match lip flaps. So like, let's go. Like when we're doing dubbing on video, it's like, oh my god, he's narrating over like stuff happening in the background. Boom, we can do whatever we want. We don't even have to match when he's talking. It's interesting that you mention
like, oh.
Yeah, no. So one thing that was really cool that Cyberpunk 2077 did with their localization, is they're using a new kind of machine learning algorithm. I forget what it's called. Oh my gosh. But what they did was they got all of the language tracks in, and then the machine learning will actually listen to the track as it's playing and identify what lip shapes it should be as they're speaking. And obviously this is very approximate, so it's not 100% perfect, especially when you get stuff like teeth and lips or teeth and tongue. But it comes very close, so you don't have to go in and manually re-rig everything animation-wise to work for different languages. It will kind of automatically, what is it, like contextually, conceptually build it out.
Right. And so that's interesting because I'm pretty sure that that's what one of the features that Valve highlighted back with Half-Life 2. With the what's his name, the mysterious guy, I don't even remember the term now, the G-Man or whatever, and they were showing him in different languages, and that it's because everything in Half-Life 2 was done in engine rather than pre-rendered. They could just say like, all right, well, he's gonna match the sound file, so let's see it go. But I feel like I heard about it back then and then never really heard about it again.
Mhm. Yep. And it's interesting too because I was really glad to hear that Cyberpunk 2077 put that much effort into making sure that like the lip flaps would match Loke because it's not something that a lot of game studios or even like movie studios think about.
Hmm.
One researcher in translation theory I always talk about is uh, Pablo Romero. Oh my God, I can't remember his name because I'm an idiot. Don't cut this part out because I'm stupid. Pablo Romero Fresco. Got it.
Oh.
Now you can cut me back in. So when I'm talking about translation theory, I always talk about Pablo Romero Fresco. He's this great guy from Spain. He does his own independent filmmaking, but he also talks about localization in when you're developing a creative thing, whether it be a film or a game. And he's mentioned stuff like the top 10 best picture winners for the
Mhm.
Oscars made 50% of their gross profit overseas, like not in an English speaking territory, but
Hmm.
they spent less than 1% of their entire budget on localization. Um,
Hmm.
and how in many industries, like between the film industry, between the game industry, localization is typically one of the later things done in the project. I've even seen some game studios say, "Oh, localization and QA," like they put the two together. When really they couldn't be complete. They're
Oh
completely
my
different.
God.
I mean,
Yeah.
LQA is its own thing. Um, but so when it comes to localizing games, we want to start as early as possible to get in on okay what's going on, how does this need to be animated and whatnot. And a lot of game studios won't do this. They'll do all their animation, they'll do all their cutscenes, they'll have the game in like a almost ready to release state, and they go, okay, cool, now we can add localization. Like all of our text is locked, let's go
Mhm.
localization. And localization, especially for a larger game, like if you're looking at a persona sized game, that's like a year, at least a year of localization if you've got like a full team of 6 or 7 translators and writers and dub script writers and stuff working on it.
I mean, it
That's
took
a
me
whole
like 2
year
years
now.
to play it.
Yeah, basically.
90
I
hours.
still haven't
That's a
finished my game of P5R. I worked on that game and I'm still like at Shido's Castle. I'm like, I have to get there eventually. But when you're starting that late in the process, so much is baked in, and the dev team has either moved on to other projects because they're just waiting
Mhm.
for you to be done with Loke and they're starting to work on the next game, or they're so like battered in QA hell, like just
Mhm.
cleaning up bugs and like touching up new features, and all of a sudden the producer comes in and goes, "Let's put in another cool feature." So now they're working on that. So when the Loke team is like, "Hey, we can't say killing God. Can we change it?" The dev team is like, "We are too busy. Right around it. Figure it out."
Mm.
And that's just not the right approach to go about it. But a lot of game studios, especially independent studios who are like, "Oh, we don't want to spend all of our money on localization," don't realize how big of like a profit enabler localization can be. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it is very difficult when you're starting so late in the process to try and go through and do your lip flap matching, or even say like, well, if we can't get this AI thing to generate the lip flaps, then we're gonna have to go through and maybe edit some of these cutscenes so that this narration segment, which is way longer in Japanese, doesn't end up with a whole bunch of awkward silence in English. So,
Mhm.
no, there's so much that you can improve upon when you start working on localization earlier in the dev process.
Mhm.
Ideally, when you're starting to work on a game and like you just get your basic story fleshed out, you can even reach out to localization studios then and say, "Hey, here's our basic story, like in our themes and whatnot. Is this going to jive in Europe or in Asia that we're looking to market this in?" And
Mhm.
very early in the process, they can point out, "Hey, this might be an issue. This might be an issue." For example, let's say we're dealing with a game maybe created in Korea, like, "Hey, we got this big fantasy MMO, and the big story beat is we need to emancipate all these slave races." And they
Mhm.
come and say, "Cool, how do we localize this for the West?" We may step in and go, "Okay, we're gonna need to talk about the history of slavery in the United
Mhm.
States and what the word slave and emancipation mean
Mhm.
for our greater communities and how it's affected our like different people
Yeah.
like it's a big deal." So being able to address that with the developers, and not like in terms of like, oh, we need to tone down the story, be like, how are we going to address this in the localization? Do we need to change things? Do we need to make this a little bit more toned down?
Mhm.
um Getting in at that early stage is really helpful, but it can also be really great for the localization team because they go, "Cool,
Yeah.
you got this amazing fantasy MMO. We can use these words for this. We can use this. Hey, if this is going to be a whole Gaelic area, we got Josh on the team. He's got his like PhD in Gaelic studies. He can help
Mhm.
you name all of your places. So really, like getting those international teams together can be such a boon, especially if you're trying to base stuff in different cultures.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then of course moving forward and be like, hey, this is how we want to make our UI look like. This is how we want to get our graphic text in. The earlier you
Mhm.
can get in and talk with your localization team, the earlier you can figure out what's going to be a pain point, how to make it so it's a little bit less painful for everybody. But yeah, and this is just talking like Japanese to English. When you're looking at going into like maybe an English to Arabic localization, there's a whole bunch more there because
Mhm.
Arabic is a right to left language.
Yeah.
So are you going to flip your UI? Do you have to add some different fonts in? Like, how are you going to cater to your localization team so they can not only do their job, like actually localize your game, but do it in a way that creates that equivalent experience for their players? So people who are playing in Arabic for the first time don't feel like they're consuming like a crappy machine translated, like spat through Google EXE, but feel like, hey, this could have been developed by somebody in our country or in our culture. Um, and it's
Mhm.
really exciting for them having that equivalent experience. So, anyways, sorry, that was like really
No, no,
long,
no.
drawn out, like
No, that's good.
random tangent, but
No, but you covered something that I think was a question I wanted to ask, right? Was to discuss sort of the ideal localization process. And it seems that, it should be, there should be involvement from the get-go rather than an after the fact, hey, can we get this to another market now?
right. And obviously, I don't mean like the second you come up with a game concept, you should start
Mhm.
calling all your loc studios, but it definitely should not be an afterthought. Like, you should not be coming out of like your pre-alpha or like going into like your fifth beta or something like that and then just starting to think, okay, what languages do we want to do this in?
Mhm.
um I don't know too much about game development myself, just because as a loc person, I tend to deal with stuff as they're towards more of the completed end of things. Um,
Mhm.
but ideally, like a pre-alpha would be great. And not only that, but providing the pre-alpha to your localization team so they can play it. You'd be surprised how many games are localized with translation teams that never even see the game.
Yeah, this we've run into that in some of our conversations that they're getting things like spreadsheets with lines out of context and it's unclear. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it used to be an issue over here. Wasn't that an issue with Oblivion where they went into the voice studio and all the voice lines were sorted alphabetically?
Oh my
I
God.
don't know.
Might have been
I don't know.
Morrowind. I can't remember which one it was, but I remember hearing that and I'm like, that sounds like something a game dev would do. It's just, oh,
Uh,
it made it easier for you. It's alphabetized. Like, no, 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 no. We don't need it alphabetized.
those are some massive games. Just the sheer volume of text and voice is just insane. I don't know how you work with that kind of thing.
I can't talk about one title in particular that posed a challenge for our localization team is when we worked on 13 Sentinels. Have you guys played 13 Sentinels?
I just downloaded the demo. I just downloaded it today on the Japanese eShop because
So good. Also, the localization is great. Our team did an amazing job. I did all the back end stuff for that. One of the biggest issues we had on back end for that is so 13 Sentinels has a lot of different storylines that converge with each other. They crisscross. So like
Mhm.
somebody's scene could happen, and then like 6 hours later in the game, you see that scene happening in the background, and you can hear what's going on while something else is happening. So it's really important that those two scenes have the exact same dialogue because you'll see it over and over again.
Mhm.
There's one route in particular where it's kind of a Groundhog Day thing where they repeat the same scene over and over and over again, and he tries to figure out how to get out of this kind of like time loop thing. So it's really important that all the characters in the time loop that aren't the main guy have the same first couple lines until they start diverging from whatever loop they're in.
Right.
And that was a really difficult thing to not only just localize but to engineer, to make sure that like all of his reactions to the same line are going to be either like, even if they're a little bit different, that all the lines are still the same. But also when we're engineering the localization back in, making sure that like all of the lines that are the same are still translated the same. um
Mhm.
so yeah, no, it's especially whenever you mix time travel into stuff, it just gets crazy. But no,
Naturally.
that was a really difficult but really rewarding part of 13 Sentinels because the localization turned out so great. Absolutely great game. Super robbed at the Game Awards. It was nominated for Best Narrative at the same year as the Final Fantasy VII remake. And of
Oh,
course, everyone voted for the Final Fantasy VII remake, even though it's a remake.
Really?
and
Yeah, that's not right.
slightly changed, rewritten for one of like the best written games ever. You have to play 13.
But the thing about the Final Fantasy VII remake, one of the reasons that I kind of just ignored it, and a friend of mine did the same, is that we know it's not complete. But it's not. How could it be best narrative if it's not complete?
I know, and 13
Right.
Sentinels is completely enclosed, and it's I I don't want to turn this into a 13 Sentinels podcast. It's a very good game.
Well,
It's on sale a lot. It is
I
on the
do-
Nintendo Switch now.
Yeah, I do want to point something out about 13 Sentinels, and one of the reasons I'm looking into the Japanese version, I don't know that I can handle it. I sit pretty comfortably on the intermediate plateau, so I just downloaded the demo to see like, can I handle this? But what it has is all these features that I think are great for a language learner. As a teacher, I've really pushed for my students to engage with media, the arts. Like this is to me, this is what makes language learning worthwhile, is finding art you love. So when it comes to games, I really want to see more of that sort of multi-language releases, which I see all over the Xbox. I love that. Sony hasn't been very clear with it, with their listings, but Xbox is usually pretty clear. Like, here, there's 23 languages. Here's the list. Does it have this? Does it have that? And I love it. The eShop has been adding that, right? And they tell you, it's got this language, this language, this language. It doesn't have the specifics that the Xbox One has, where it tells you like, what do you call it? Menus and voices and things like that. But what I was saying about Aegis Rim, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, sorry. So what I was saying about it though is that the text in that game uses, it has a log where you can go back and listen to each line. So even though it doesn't have, say, furigana or anything for someone like me, I can listen to it and then find out what that word is. And I could go back to that log at any time. That's like a complete game changer. That makes that product then a viable learning resource. And I really like that.
Yeah, that's actually pretty standard on a lot of visual novels.
Yeah, I see that with the Spike Chunsoft releases that have been coming to Xbox recently too. And it's just like changes everything.
Yeah, no, that feature is actually localized in the English version on 13 Sentinels, because in Japanese, it's vertical right to left, and it's
Mm,
localized in the English version to be left to right and then down.
nice. Yeah. So I am looking into that game right now. I said I
It's really
downloaded the
good.
demo.
It's usually on Switch. It's on Switch. It's on sale because it's been out for a bit.
is Aegis Rim on sale now?
It's been on sale for a bit. I don't
Is
know if
it?
it's on sale right now. I'm not at Sega, so I don't know what like sales are going on
Oh
right now.
yeah.
But
Okay.
it's
Okay.
frequently on
I
sale. Yeah,
Yeah. It's not
it's
on
a very
sale
good
right
game.
now on the Japanese eShop, but I have seen it in the past month or so. I've seen it go to 40 on both platforms, I think.
That
Hmm.
downloaded fully Japanese from the U.S. store, so for the demo did anyway. So
Oh,
Hmm.
I
wow.
think we might be good. No Play Asia on that one.
Yeah.
Store credits.
All right. Well, that was a very long discussion of equivalent experience, I think.
Yes, and a localization of games, and start early if you can.
Yeah.
Are there
So,
any other? Sorry, Mike. One real
no,
quick.
no.
Are there any other we talk about modulation. You talk about modulation and translation chat. Jen O'Donnell's podcast. We listened to that one as research for interviewing you. And we talked about equivalent experience. Are there any other kind of translation terms? Anything you can reveal from your masters and all that?
Absolutely. So one kind of esoteric concept I really, really love, is polysystem theory. And we kind of
Mhm.
touched on this a little bit earlier. And polysystem theory is the theory that describes how culture, there's not just one culture. Culture is like an onion. There's layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. So, when I'm in America, so American culture, but I'm in Southern California. So we got some Southern California culture in there. I use language a little bit differently when I see freeways. I use the 101 or the 50. Um,
Mm.
I have a little bit of that Southern California twang every now and then. I used to speak like a valley girl because I grew up in the valley when I was a kid. So we've got that. We've got internet culture that we've grown up with, we've also got anime and video game culture. So there's different words and whatnot. So you're like, oh man, you got so much, you got so pwned earlier. That's also part of that culture. And not it doesn't just extend to language, but also what's socially acceptable to do or what's not to do. If we were playing like Final Fantasy 14, there's a culture in that as well. Like I was just explaining to one of our friends who's a new player, like no, you have to let the tank go first. Like the tank goes first in the dungeon, and she didn't understand that. And I was like, no, that's just part of the culture of the game is you let the tank go first. So culture comes in so many different layers, and depending on where we are, who we're talking to, what has happened to us, we engage in all these different little bubbles of culture. So when we're translating something, say written by like a Japanese game writer, developed by a Japanese game studio in the Japanese culture, in the years following the attack on Shinzo Abe. So certain themes have been skewed because of different political events that are happening. When you take something like that and go, okay, cool, let's just plop it as is into this polysystem of cultures, things kind of get warped. I always compare it to kind of like taking a fish. So you've got like a saltwater fish in this nice like little baby tank. It's like perfectly pH balanced, it's got the right amount of salt and whatnot. You can't just take that fish and like yeet it into the ocean. Because the ocean is going to be a completely different environment. So you may need to give the fish, like you may need to feed it some special food before you put it in the ocean water, or you might need to like give it some extra little flotation devices to help it float in the currents. Like it's a completely different environment with different expectations. And if you don't want the fish to die or drown like right away as you put it in, you might have to make a couple, not changes to the fish. The fish is still going to be the fish, but you might need to give some stuff to the fish to help it survive in this new environment. And that's where localization comes in. So when you've got like a really short phrase like yoroshiku, which can mean so many different things depending on what culture or context you're in, how you translate that is going to depend on like what kind of macrocosm you're going into. One really cool example of polysystem theory I always bring up is when we're looking at fantasy between cultures. So, and this is like your medieval fantasy, knights, princesses, dragons, that kind of shit. When you look at that and how the language is used to write it in Japanese, it's very different from the language we might use in fantasy in English. So like English high fantasy, you're looking at a lot of like kind of more medieval-esque language, like you're looking at your British accent, like Game of Thrones-esque. They're not going to use words like okay. They're not going to use modern slang. They're definitely not going to use like yo cowabunga, yo like por qué no las dos. Like they're not going to throw in random Spanish words because in our culture, we're going to be like, well, how do they know Spanish? They're in Westeros. Like, Spanish doesn't exist in Westeros. You're going to tell me Spain came and colonized Westeros? Like, that's just the culture of high fantasy over here with fans of high fantasy. You don't see that in Japan. You'll see a lot of the fantasy writing will have, English loan words in it. You'll see things that might seem strange, or like the ways that they write certain scenes might be in a much more modern context, but just imagine that they're in like the medieval world. So that the way that they use language just in that genre is completely different how we use it in English. So when we translate it over, we might need to make some changes. So a lot of the time when I'm translating stuff that's high fantasy, obviously in Japanese, they'll be like, oh, Marie-san, have you talked to the count? Blah, 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 don't know. I drop all of those because it wouldn't make sense. They're not in Japan. They're in like Westeros. Like Japanese doesn't exist. Why would he call someone san if they're not speaking Japanese? And Japanese as a culture, as a concept, doesn't exist. So stuff like that is a example of how taking one thing from one culture, like Japanese culture, Japanese high fantasy fiction culture, can completely change when you bring it into like Western English written high fantasy culture. So very, 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 very specific, but super, super, super cool for me. Like,
well, I just recently played through my second game in Japanese. The first one was Blue Dragon many years ago, which was a very lengthy process with the sort of Sonomama Rakubiki Jiten on my DS way back when. But I played Chrono Trigger from around January. And I had played it in English maybe 10 years prior. And so Frog, that character's mannerisms, speech in English, completely focused on that sort of medieval English, right? Whereas in Japanese, it was just Japanese.
Yep. And you'll see that in the localization of Final Fantasy 14, which is brilliant,
Mm,
also does that. In you listen to it in Japanese, and they're just speaking plain ass Japanese, like
mm,
using English slang words, like completely different. But of course, it's high fantasy in English. Like we expect it to have a little bit of that medieval flair, so they've added that in.
yeah.
Um, and obviously, like there are certain things that I think the 14 team does that, like if I was in charge of localization in all of 14, I probably wouldn't do, but that's just my personal take. But what they have decided to do, they've done a really great job, which is a great segue into my last part of translation theory that I love to talk about, which is defining what makes a good translation. Because a lot of people will be like, "Oh, well, a good translation has to be accurate," and I'm like, not necessarily. A good
Mhm,
translation doesn't need to be accurate. A good translation needs to be successful. And the way we define success is by saying, like, well, what are our goals for this translation to do? Kind of like I said
mhm,
before, it's not always about equivalent experience. If I'm taking, Chrono Trigger and trying to translate it in a way that these PhD docs will get what they need, or if I'm
mhm,
showing it to like a class and like breaking it down into very, very literal sentences, that's going to be completely different. But those translations can still be good because they're successful. They accomplish what we set out to do.
mhm,
So like the big thing that people always get kind of offended when I say is like we look back at stuff like the Four Kids dub of Pokemon or One Piece
mhm,
and whatnot, where they changed a lot of stuff. People nowadays will be like, I don't want to see it like that. Like it's not supposed to be like that. But you have to admit, it was a very successful localization. They set out, they said, okay, we need to take One Piece and we need to make it marketable towards children and not get completely blown off the network like by super angry parents.
yeah.
And they created a really strong fan base for it amongst their target audience. Um, and obviously they made a lot of changes. There's a lot of weird jelly donuts and like
Yeah.
crazy stuff that we still meme about to this day, but you have to admit they were very successful at what they were trying to do with their translation.
I used to
Um,
really hope that I could wake up early on a Saturday to catch, Ultimate Muscle.
yes, no, and of course, like you'll get a lot of these die-hard prescriptivists, like literal translation, like this is the best way to consume something is like through Google Translate. Will say like, no, that's not good. I'm like, well, that's because it's not specifically catered to you. It's
Mhm,
catered to a completely different audience. Just because it's not for you doesn't mean it's not good. Like I can't
mhm.
eat food with cilantro in it because I have the weird gene that makes it taste like soap. That
Oh
doesn't
yeah.
Yeah.
mean that the food made by that five-star chef that has cilantro in it is bad. It's just not for me. So
Mhm,
no, so translation is successful. And you have to determine your approach. And sometimes your approach can be unsuccessful, and then you can say it's a bad translation. Like when you're translating something through Google Translate, like a menu for a restaurant, and it comes out like with a completely wrong food item, that's not successful because you wanted it to have the same food item, but just in the other language.
Yeah, we've talked about this on a few other episodes where sometimes with because Japanese and English are so inherently different, you can have a Japanese sentence here and an English sentence, and the translation here, the English side will have essentially none of the words from the Japanese side, but it's still the correct translation, or it's still a good translation. You know what I mean? Like that's one thing that I think people should probably. I mean, I'm not a professional translator. I've done it here and there, but I don't do it professionally anymore. But yeah, this is what people should know that don't know anything about this. I know it's strange, but it has literally none of the words from the Japanese side. It's still good.
hmm
mhm,
No, and I think that's a very Western kind of monolingual thing. We have a
Yeah,
mhm.
history in our country of we don't typically consume stuff that's translated because there's
that's
there's
right.
there's
That's
so
right.
much history behind why we don't consume stuff that's translated, and I am not qualified to talk about it. But
Mhm,
compared to something like um, places in Europe where like you grew up speaking French, like you might be consuming a lot of stuff that's been translated into French from different languages versus you grow up in America, it's huge.
That's
We got some
true. That's true.
xenophobia going on, so we're not going to be
mhm.
watching like the strange stuff with subtitles because we have to read while we're watching our TV.
I don't read
Um,
no movie.
yeah, basically. I mean, it was hard getting my parents to be like, "Yo, let's watch like Coda or something." Like, well, I don't want to read the subtitles. I'm like, yeah, but
Yeah.
you gotta read the subtitles, mom and dad. Come on, like you can read. Anyways, but yeah, so because we don't have this culture of reading stuff or consuming stuff in translation, it's very easy for us to create these misconceptions. Not to say that other cultures don't have their own misconceptions about translation, but it's much
Hmm.
easier for us as monolinguals who aren't exposed to a lot of stuff in translation to have these ideas. But just as you said, like, if it's not always word to word, it should never be word to word, unless
Hmm.
you're teaching maybe a language class. But if translation were as easy as just translate the words, like pick them out of the dictionary, then Google Translate would be freaking perfect. And why would you have to hire me in the first
Yeah.
place? The issue with language is, like I explained earlier, with the Esperanto gaining all of its irregular forms now, is that language was created by humans, and it's so inherent to us that it just becomes complicated. It evolves, it changes, depending on what culture you're in, it affects the language, depending what historical event just happened. I mean, like
Hmm.
after 9/11, we were all saying freedom fries instead of French fries for stupid political reasons.
Hmm.
Um, and oh God, I hate to be the translator who had to explain that to them and be like, no, I know they're French fries. I have to use freedom for like the next 6 months because X, Y, and Z happened. But that's how translation works. And one
Hmm.
thing too with Japanese to English is that Japanese is a very high context language, and English is a very low context language. So what
Yeah.
that means is when I say a sentence in English, you will have all the information you need to know to understand it for the most part. So I'll say
Yeah.
like I'm eating this cake. I'm saying like, cool. Who's eating the cake? I am currently in the process of eating the cake. But in
Yeah.
Japanese, you don't always have to list the subject. You don't have to list the amount of things that are happening. You don't know the gender of the person who's speaking, or the person you're talking to. So a lot of that you have to infer from the context, as we say it's a high context language. So
Hmm.
if you don't know who's there, they just go, cake tabeteru. It's like, oh, who's eating the cake? How much cake are they
Yeah.
eating? What is the gender of the person eating the cake? Um, like what's going on with that? So there's so much that just gets left out of the language. That's why sites and stuff like Google and machine translation, like even DeepL, will really have an issue with that.
Hmm.
I think Japanese is ahead of the curve because if you look at the way English is kind of evolving right now, people always say, like, especially with posts on the internet, went to the beach today, went to the mall today. There's no I. Like we're starting to lose the subject, and when I see sentences like that, I'm like, are we evolving into Japanese kinda here? You know?
And of course, that's all within the cultural context of the internet, which
Yeah,
Yeah.
itself
yeah,
is constrained by things like back when text speak was a thing that was only created because you were limited in the amount of characters you
Yeah.
could write on your phone. And you had to punch each one out separately.
right.
Versus nowadays, you can type as much as you want. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's super duper interesting. And I was totally gonna go somewhere with a context, and I completely forgot. Oh yeah, so the cool thing with a high context and a low context thing is it works its way into all the fiction and stuff. So,
Hmm.
you'll get a lot of the stuff you see in like anime or video games and stuff is you'll have a character that everyone presumes is male, and then all of a sudden they take off their helmet and it's a girl. And that's supposed to be a big reveal. We can't do that in English because we always have to gender the third person. And if we don't
Hmm.
gender them, then it's like, oh, well, then that person, oh, they use they, them pronouns,
Mm.
or do they identify as non binary? Or like, why
Hmm.
are we using they, them when clearly this person is presenting in a masculine way? Like, it becomes a whole lot more complicated, especially when you add all the extra cultural stuff that we're going through with, recognition of gender identity in, the West. So
Yeah.
there's that kind of interesting thing. And then also talking about gender with machine translation is
Hmm.
that as good as machines are, they still take in our biases. I was realizing this earlier. I ran something through DeepL, just kind of like a gist translation. And it was an article about like a female doctor who had discovered something, but they didn't list the gender because in Japanese, you don't have to list the gender of the third person pronoun. But DeepL assumed it was a man
Huh.
because it
Mm.
said like, oh, the professor showed his invention on TV, and it's like,
Right.
no, why are you assuming it's he? DeepL, do you default to he all the time? What's wrong with
Yeah.
that? So it's really interesting how language technology evolves. We're still going to see a lot of these inherent biases,
Hmm.
and that's not just because like, oh, we're trying maybe randomize it to a he, she, or whatnot, but there's no way DeepL could have known it was male or female
Right.
based on what I put in because there are none of those markers. I would need to read the whole article And even in that, it may not even list whether or not Shizuku Sensei is a man or a woman. So I might have to go as a translator and do some Wikipedia digging to see, is Shizuku Sensei a man, a woman? Like, how do they identify as? So I'm using the
Hmm.
correct pronouns for them. And that's something DeepL and other machine translation platforms just aren't ready to do yet. They're not ready to
Yeah.
do that level of research just for the bare minimum of what pronoun do I use for this person.
Yeah. And that's the thing I think a lot of folks forget, you know, when it comes to machines, when it comes to computers, they're not smart. They're not. They're only as smart as we make them and what we put into it. So it's possible, it's entirely possible that the person coding for DeepL is like, oh, well, I'm just going to put the masculine pronoun as the default. You never know. But
It was coded by a guy, especially, probably. You know, who knows?
Who knows? I mean, we even see this issue in the game industry on our end with like the Blizzard's diversity septangle or whatever it is, where the default is like white male, 20 years old, and like, oh, you are female, you're very high on the gender, I see. So
yeah. So it's measuring its variance from that.
like, you're not white. Well, how dark are you? Let's go up on the line. So
I often wonder, talking about the pronouns and gender identity stuff going on in the West mainly now. I wonder, like, because they and them are essentially genderless, right? But karera and kanojora are gendered, so there's not that you can't say they them as a pronoun for a non-binary person in Japanese, right? So I wonder, have you come across this in localization efforts? Has this been addressed at all from the Japanese side of things?
yeah, so I'm probably not the best person to speak on it. There's some really great non-binary activists on Twitter and whatnot that are talking a lot about this. But from what I've seen, obviously Japanese, you don't use karera or kanojora a lot.
Not that much.
You
That's
will
true.
usually say
Yeah.
like Maikutachi, like Mike
Yeah,
and
yeah,
all
that's
the
right.
people.
That's right.
Or
That's
you'll
right.
say something like the businessmen, like you'll use either Itachi or like Shakain wa. So you're not gonna use a they them as in like a korera or a karera or like a something like that. You're not gonna use that often. So it's really easy to hedge around that. I mean, very little times you're even gonna use like a karewa. You'll usually use
Right.
like maikuwa. You'll use the person's name or the person's last name or the person's title, like kaichou wa kouyu koto ga suki desu, instead of actually using a pronoun. So I don't think, from what I've seen, like in terms of handling pronouns in Japanese, hasn't been as big of a concern.
Right.
There has been a push to allow like X gender on birth certificates, being referred to as like as genderless or like X gender as a concept. But when it comes to gendered language, it's not as pressing of an issue, I would say, as it is in a language like English, or a much more heavily gendered language such as French or Spanish, where they
Yeah.
are developing new forms of language to accommodate it. So instead of being a professor or profesora, I've seen some non-binary Spanish speakers use profesore. We're using the
Oh, wow.
as a gender neutral kind of substitute.
That's woven right into the fabric of Romance languages. That's going to be tougher with Japanese. Japanese. I guess you're right. I hadn't thought about that. They just they don't lean on pronouns nearly as much as we do. They've all again, they're ahead of the curve. They've been skirting around it, not skirting, but they just don't use it as much.
Their own issues to deal with when it comes to those kind of things. If you're interested, actually, pretty much every Netflix original nowadays is dubbed into Japanese. In the last season of She-Ra, which I'm wearing the shirt today, perfect.
Oh, nice.
There's a non-binary character called Double Trouble, and they use they them pronouns. So I actually watched the whole series in English, and then I rewatched it in Japanese. Fantastic dub.
Oh, wow.
A lot of Japanese dubs on Netflix are very, very good.
Cool.
But
Netflix
the way
is good, man.
they didn't have to handle it. They just, they don't have to use a pronoun. They'd be like "Daburu torabura ko yuta." Like, okay, you don't have to use a pronoun
using
there.
names all the time. So
Perfect, yeah. But they run into their own issues when it comes to stuff like, say, like when there's like a big love confession. It's like, okay, am I using suki? Am I using like hoshi, am I using aishiteru? Like how hard are we going there? So it's really interesting to see not only like English, like Japanese to English localization, but how you have to go the other way, like what difficulties they have going from English to Japanese.
Hmm.
Highly recommend that if you're really interested in learning more about that. BoJack Horseman,
Hmm.
fantastic Japanese dub, and that
Wow.
is an entire
Okay.
series that is based around all of its animal puns. There are all those different bits where Princess Carolyn does all of her different like tongue twisters, which she'll have a 2-minute segment where she constructs a really crazy tongue twister, and how they create that tongue twister in Japanese will be a completely different tongue twister but have the same meaning. It's really, really, really cool.
That's
Um,
incredible.
Yes. So highly recommend if you guys are interested in studying Japanese and whatnot, watching those Japanese dubs of stuff
Hmm.
that's made in English, because you can either watch it in English and watch this, read the subtitles, or you can watch it with the English CC and then in the Japanese audio. So that's what I did with BoJack, and
Yeah.
I learned so many cool things.
Yeah,
That's
Netflix is a
awesome.
really nice learning resource too that I would recommend for students. I said like this is just
Absolutely.
it's great. There's a ton of stuff. Anybody should be able to find something they like, and all these Netflix originals have like 20 different subtitles and dub tracks.
Yeah.
There's some language learning plugins if you watch Netflix on your browser as well, I
Yeah.
think, and that can help you. You turn on the subs, and then it has like like Likai-kun or whatever, or
Hmm.
Yeah.
Likai-chan, something like that. Look up Netflix, language
Yeah.
learning plugins, and you'll find it.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it was called Language Reactor.
yeah, maybe that
Interesting.
was it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
Uh,
I'm wondering to get back to this sort of translation theory and how it affects your work. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the general process, like what is the nitty gritty details, or even an overview of details of how you would go about in your recent works in
Yeah.
translation, and how this translation theory is coming into play in the process, or is it not? Is it not getting
Yeah.
enough attention?
So I think for me, translation theory is something that I apply when I start running into difficulties. So when I run into like the yoroshiku, or like, oh, now
Mhm.
we're running into this really difficult section where we have to put a lot of information into a really short line. What are we going to do? So it's something that's always in the back of my mind, but doesn't really come out until I really need the big guns. Like, okay, this is going to be hard. Let's
Mhm.
look at it through the lens of theory. Like, how can we achieve the equivalent experience without completely mutilating the line? Because it is very easy when you're translating to get caught up on the words in the source text, especially if you've been staring at it for like the last 2-3 hours.
Mhm.
So when it comes out for me most of the time, like I said, is when I'm stumbling, when I've been really having a hard time wording something. Sometimes I'll just even translate it really literally and put a note saying like, come back and check this when I'm not so in the weeds of the language.
Mhm,
Mhm.
Because I'll
mhm.
come back, I'll take like a 2 or 3 hour break, and I'll come back and only look at the English side of things.
Mhm.
Think, okay, what was the intent? I don't even want to look at the Japanese text right now. What were they saying? Because I have the literal translation. How do I make this sound natural and create that equivalent experience in English? So that's
Mhm.
typically how it comes out for me. But
Now,
in terms, go ahead.
are you doing this mostly alone? Do you work with a team or anything?
Yeah, so it
Have you
depends
had
on
occasion
what.
to work with a whole team, or
Yeah, no, so, working on video game localization through Sega is all done as a team.
Mhm.
So typically each team member would be assigned a different aspect of the game. So we'll have maybe like 2 people on main story, we'll have 1 person on this. Like on 13 Sentinels, because it was split across 13 protagonists and each one of them had their own arc, it was like, okay, this translator and editor are gonna have these 3, this translator and editor is gonna have
Mm.
these 3. When I was working on Etrian, it was someone was on main story, someone was on side quests. I got to do some
Mm.
NPC dialogue, and then any side quest that involved that NPC. And then I also did like the system text, the item descriptions, the weapons
Mhm.
descriptions. So typically all the work gets split up. And then of course when the text comes in, you translate the text. If you're working by yourself and you don't have an editor, you will usually go back through and tweak the text to sound a little bit more natural in English. If
Mhm.
you're working with a separate editing team, then your editor will come through, go say like, hey, okay, so this needs to be a lot shorter because we're doing this as a dub script. So they'll go
Mhm.
through and make sure that the same meaning is expressed, but just in a different, more natural way to work with like the voice actors and whatnot. And then once that's done, we'll usually do a final go over, like a QC, and then turn that into the dev. And then once the
Mhm.
dev bakes all the game text into the game, and I'm saying this like as a very simple process. No, it takes forever to make sure everything's baked in properly. That's when it goes to LQA, language QA. And
Mhm.
then our QA testers will go through the game. Those QA testers will often be assigned, like, okay, I want you to do this section, only use fire attacks. I want you to do this section. I need you to use water and air attacks to make sure all of the water and air aspected attacks all have no
Mhm.
typos and whatnot.
Mm.
QA is not just playing the video game and just having fun. It is like imagine you say, okay, Cole, you're going to play Persona 5. You're only ever going to use these 3 party members. Never put the other party members in your party, and you need to use every attack at least 3 times. And every time
Mhm.
you use it, you need to write down exactly what they said and make sure there's no typos and stuff. So, not a very fun job, QA, but so essential.
Yeah.
But we'll go through LQA, we'll fix any text bugs that are in there, make sure everything fits in all the text boxes. Because sometimes you think, okay, this will definitely fit. And then once it's in the game, you're like, oh, there's like 3 words like hanging off the end of the text box. So you have to go back through and delete a couple words, make it fit in.
Mm.
So that process will go through, and then it'll usually go through, get finally baked in and then shipped off. So yeah, so I've been really lucky working at Sega. I was able to work with a larger team. Some of
Mhm.
our teams are as small as like 4. For bigger games, you could have like the whole team on deck. So we got like all 5 translators. We got all of our editors on there. Let's go. We got to pump this
Mm.
out. But then working in like anime and manga is all like one woman show. Like for manga, I might have an editor that will go through and touch up the dialogue, make things a little more jazzier. When it comes to anime, it's me. Whatever I write in an Excel document is what goes up
Uh-huh.
on Netflix.
Oh
And if I
wow.
make a typo, I better believe I have to fix it before I send it in because it will show up on Netflix.
They
Oh
don't they
Um,
wow.
don't have somebody go and check that?
I think Netflix does, but for a lot of my anime stuff, sometimes it makes it through. Like the subtitler may not catch it because they're so busy trying to get
Yeah.
all the subtitles put together. So yeah,
Mm.
so I have to be really careful. But yeah, no editor will go through and rewrite stuff, which is interesting in its own right. For anime projects, it's great because there's not that much text and it's all kind of contained within those like 13 or 26 episodes. So I get a
Mhm.
chance to really get close to the text and make it all perfect and nice and like apply all my theory. But when you're
Mm.
working with a game, when it's so much like Persona 5 or something was like 3 or 4 million JPCs, I'm probably way more than that actually.
Sorry,
Um,
did you say GPCs?
Japanese characters, JPC.
Oh, JPCs. Oh.
Yes, which is like
Mm.
1 to 2 million words.
Mm.
For one person to do that whole game would be crazy.
Mm.
So, obviously, when you're trying, you don't want it to take 10 years to come out, so you want to assign multiple people to it.
I think it
So,
did take 10 years to come out.
oh my gosh, whatever.
Right, so
Well,
what
I mean, the
Persona 5 is
localization.
yeah,
The game
I know.
company doesn't want to wait 10 years for, because again, when they're giving you it and saying, "Hey, here's the script, please localize our gigantic Persona-sized game,"
Mm.
they're very close to being done. They may be like, "Cool, here's the game. We need this back in 3 months, so we can
Yeah.
release it at the same time." And then we go,
Mm.
"Okay, how are we translating this whole game in
Yeah,
3 months?"
it's been a really interesting push, like, it's sort of a wonderful thing to look at and be like, "Wow, look at these global simultaneous releases," but I'm definitely of
Yes.
the mindset of, like, "It's okay, man, take your time, make sure it works
Yeah,
right." Like,
Mhm.
definitely.
it's not a big deal.
Yeah. No, and we're seeing a huge push industry-wide, not just in gaming, but, in anime, you've seen us go from, like 12 to 15 years ago, you had to buy, like, a DVD of 4 episodes, like, 2 years after it came out in Japan, but now you can
Yeah.
watch it same day, same time it's on Japanese TV, which is really
Yeah.
cool, and we're seeing the same shift in gaming. I mean, back when, like, P5 was released, I forget what the delay was there, but now we're releasing stuff, like Lost Judgment or
Mhm.
like Shin Megami Tensei 5. And I think other Japanese game companies are doing this as
I
well.
see that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's
So,
just this amazing thing because obviously, I grew up in a different time, it was years behind or maybe if at all. And, usually, it was a very different experience, I would think, it's
yeah. No, it's and it's definitely different working on a game that is sim ship or simultaneous shipment
Mhm,
versus something that's delayed. Because when you're working delayed, usually the game is done.
mhm.
Like, they're not changing the text on the fly, they're not doing their last touch-ups, so you don't have to worry about stuff like that. You can play the whole game from start to finish before you even start to translate it, which can be great, especially when you got like crazy twists in the third act or like the sudden gender reveal, so you know how to prepare everything. When you're working on a game that's still in production to do the simultaneous ship, stuff is constantly changing, whether it's like all of a sudden they changed the color of characters' shoes. Now you have to go back and be like, shit, I hope I didn't insert a reference
Yeah.
to the guy's shoes. Or you even get issues that don't affect you but will affect your workflow. For example, in a game, we had a developer decide that one character, instead of using the kanji ore, he would use katakana ore. And they just did a search and replace for all those characters' lines. But in our program, it makes it look like 2,300 lines just got changed. We need to go through every single one and
Yeah.
make sure they didn't change something else. Because God forbid, like the writers decided, oh, we're also going to retouch like these 5 lines he uses. Now the translation is not accurate. Now we go into LQA and he's saying something completely stupid for what he's actually doing.
Mm.
So, and of
Yeah.
course, like, they might have told us, oh yeah, we just replaced all of his orders. We still have to be 100% sure and do our due diligence. So there's a lot of crazy things can happen while a game is still in development, and so many things are changing. Even like down to the smallest details might have to be completely triple checked by our side. But it's super worth it to be able to release same day and see both like Japanese audiences and Western audiences having the same kind of reveals or having those same moments of like, oh my god, I just got to chapter 3 and this crazy thing happened. Versus you, when you weren't doing simultaneous ship, you get people who are diehard fans would watch like a full playthrough in Japanese and be completely spoiled by the time they got to it in English. So I think in terms of creating equivalent experience, not just for the players but for the community, simultaneous ship is really important to create that culture of, hey, we all just experienced this for the first time. And with how globalized we are with hashtags and
Yeah.
stuff, like I can go on Twitter and see people memeing about stuff in Japan about a game that also just released this day, and we can interact with each other. I think that's the beauty of SimShip, is just creating that wider global community, and that is a super corny place for me to stop.
So, do you feel that Japanese audiences want something different from stories altogether in games and other media than Western audiences? Do you think that Japanese gamers enjoy dialogue differently than the way Westerners enjoy dialogue? And does that affect how you localize dialogue?
That's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
But I think it ties into stuff that I talked about in terms of like polysystem theory. How this question is coming from a place where they understand that the way that someone in another culture expects there to be more dialogue in a game versus like in American culture, maybe we don't expect there to be as much dialogue in a game. Um, there is a history of game development in each of our respective countries, and I'm just going to use the United States as a generalization for now, um, that has completely differently changed. I mean, look at like Western RPGs versus JRPGs. Very different design concepts, and those are all rooted in the culture of game development, which of course is rooted in the culture of storytelling, or games that were developed like in that culture before electronic gaming was a thing. So there's so much history and culture underlying where we came from in terms of game development. So I think absolutely, what a culturally Japanese audience might expect of dialogue in a game, or even just the amount of dialogue or what dialogue to expect from a game of a certain genre or of a certain type, is going to be different from the expectation of a generic American who might be playing their like 50th video game or something like that. And that's because those polysystems exist and they've got all this culture and history backing it up. I don't think it necessarily comes into my thinking as much when I'm translating, mostly because like when we're translating a JRPG for an American audience, it's for an American audience that likes JRPGs. You're not gonna like, I love my little brother, but he's a Call of Duty bro at heart, and there's no way in hell I'm going to convince him to play Final Fantasy 14.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's just, that's just the culture. So when we're, or like even when I'm translating anime, I know this isn't going to be shown in like a theater, like a Ghibli film. Like this isn't something that like my mom and dad are going to watch. Like I don't need to turn stuff into jelly donuts. I don't need to strip at all the honorifics. If I say something like, "Oh, notice me, senpai," like 99% of the people who are watching are going to understand it because they are part of this anime Japanese fan like polyculture. So that does come into effect when we're going into the audience, is like, what does the audience expect? So there's going to be a lot of stuff I don't localize. There's going to be a lot of stuff I keep in. There's no reason to completely redo the combat system from this JRPG just because maybe it's a little esoteric to my brother who likes to play Call of Duty. Like, we're bringing it to JRPG fans who specifically like JRPGs, and maybe their friends who will take a taste and like JRPGs too. So I don't think it comes into, to answer the question, I don't think it comes into play too much. But it is something we should definitely think about because, when you start understanding the intention, the history, the culture in which something was created, when you understand that fishbowl where the fish lives, the more you know about that fish's life and where it came from and how it might survive in this new ocean, the better job you can do preparing it for the ocean. To complete my really grandiose metaphor.
All right.
But yeah, no, that's a really interesting question to ask. Yeah, no, I like it. As a theorist, I really, really like that.
Yeah, the Call of Duty bro versus the Dragon Quest lovers it started out in Japan, obviously, but we have two, and it started with Asteroids versus Pac-Man. Like, this sort of difference in taste in gaming has been going on for quite some time. So,
and that's not to say that there aren't people in Japan who love like Call of Duty. Like,
that is true. They
play the shit out of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, and there's different audiences and different cultures. Like, there's people in Japan who consider themselves really big Western gamers, and they're really excited about the new Call of Duty or the new FIFA or that kind of thing. So it's very interesting. It's a very interesting question.
It is. It's a good thing to have that kind of diversity, though. It shows the maturity of the medium.
That is true. That's a good point, Mike. I like that.
It's a very diverse medium, and we are becoming increasingly global. Games are for everyone in every culture, and everyone should play games because they're fun. The end.
Well, I would say thank you for your time, but I'm thinking maybe something more along the lines of, it is difficult.
Chomate, yo.
A kind act such as you being here does not exist so easily.
Well, Thank you very much for having me. This was great.
That was the appropriate reaction.
Thank you. That was great.
All right. Well, thank you, Katrina, for coming on. The episode is wonderful. It was a pleasure to talk with you. And everybody, thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Music.
And if you really liked us, please join us on Patreon, where you can become a member of our Patreon, which is patreon.com/gaminggaiden. And there we have 2 tiers. The first tier is a tip jar. It's just a $1 tier, and we'll give you a shout out on somewhere. I'm going to cut this part out. It's basically a tip jar. And then tier 2 is our $5 bonus episode tier, and we have bonus content. There's some extra bonus episodes, and these are Mike and me only, and instead of the interview, so we're just talking about games and retro gaming and our nostalgia and ranking games and things like that. So check that out. You can cancel anytime, and that's basically it, everybody. Thanks for tuning in once again to Gaming Gaiden, and we'll check you later.
Have a good one.